Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about Russia making a major breakthrough on the battlefield in Ukraine. In addition, Trump is engaging in a war of words and has sent 2 submarines to threaten Russia. International relations scholar Mearsheimer says the dumbest thing the US did was to push Russia toward China. The war between Russia and Ukraine has been a stalemate for a long time, but recently there has been a breakthrough. On July 31st, Russia announced that after 16 months of fierce fighting, Russian forces had captured the key eastern Ukrainian city of Chasiv Yar. Russian paratroopers raised their flag over the city. Russia praised the bravery and fearlessness of the paratroopers who took part in the battle, ignoring Trump's increasingly tough demands for a ceasefire. On July 31st, this news instantly became the focal point of the Russia-Ukraine battlefield. This battle, which lasted for 483 days, ranks as the 3rd longest in the Russia-Ukraine war. Chasiv Yar is one of the key defensive lines of the Ukrainian armed forces in northern Donetsk, and it holds significant strategic value. Chasiv Yar sits atop high ground between Bakhmut, which is crucial for Ukrainian forces, and several other cities. Once Russian forces capture the high ground where Chasiv Yar is located, they will be able to overlook the Sloviansk River Valley in eastern Ukraine from above, and can launch attacks on the valley area at any time, like a tiger descending from the mountain. This would be equivalent to opening the gateway for Russian troops to advance into the heartland of eastern Ukraine from this direction. The fall of Chasiv Yar would be like the first domino falling, potentially triggering a chain collapse of the Ukrainian defensive system in the remaining areas of Donetsk. Additionally, let's shift our attention to another long-contested strategic stronghold, Krasnohorivka. Russian forces have already entered parts of the city and are continuing to expand their control within the urban area. The Ukrainian forces have failed to effectively suppress Russian troop infiltration and concentration. Assault units from the Russian Central Group have reportedly entered the northern part of Krasnohorivka near Chasky Street and are engaged in combat near the train station. The Ukrainian troops were caught off guard, leading to panic. The Russian strategic intent is clear, to split Krasnohorivka into eastern and western sections. At present, almost all Ukrainian supply lines are under Russian fire control, and half of Ukraine's transport vehicles are unable to reach the city. Although the Ukrainian command has deployed reserve units for support, there doesn't seem to be enough infantry, making them appear powerless on the battlefield. The Ukrainian forces there are like being stuck in a quagmire. The more they struggle, the harder it is to break free. Ukraine is facing major problems with both manpower and munitions. NATO's ammunition supply is insufficient, and Ukraine has also run out of soldiers. After more than 3 years of war, all the Ukrainians fit for battle have already enlisted. Ukrainian conscription squads often round up able-bodied men on the streets, facing significant resistance. Some Ukrainians have even reported the squad's locations to the Russian military, asking them to launch missile strikes against the conscription teams. Recently, as Russian forces continue to advance on the battlefield, Trump, who once claimed he could end the Russia-Ukraine war within 24 hours, finds himself in an awkward position. On July 29th, Trump warned that if Russia did not accept his proposed peace plan within 10 days, he would impose additional tariffs on Moscow and take other punitive measures. This statement sparked a war of words between Trump and former Russian President Medvedev. Trump called Medvedev a failed president and said he should watch his language. Medvedev immediately responded on July 31st, saying that if a few words from a former Russian president could make the current so-called powerful American president so nervous, then clearly Russia is on the right path and will continue down this road. He also mentioned that Russia still possesses a dead hand, an automatic nuclear retaliation system, warning the US not to underestimate the risks. These remarks angered Trump. On August 1st, Trump responded on his own Truth Social platform, saying that in light of Medvedev's highly provocative statements, he had decided to deploy 2 nuclear submarines to appropriate areas, in case these foolish and inflammatory words turned out to be more than just talk. It's worth noting that Trump has actually always been reluctant to go after Putin, but when faced with Medvedev's provocation, he couldn't hold back and even sent out nuclear submarines to make a show of force. However, Trump's old friend, former Fox News host Carlson, doesn't really support Trump's actions this time. He interviewed the renowned American international relations scholar John Mearsheimer, who said that NATO's support for Ukraine in fighting this proxy war has only led to repeated defeats, exposing its own lack of strength, and that this approach is a complete failure. Mearsheimer said that this is a devastating defeat for NATO, because they have poured a huge amount of resources into this war. The problem now is that the United States sees China as its main threat. China is America's peer competitor, whereas Russia is no longer the Soviet Union. China is the real peer competitor. The United States has been trying to respond to China's challenge to its dominance in Asia. Back in 2001, when Albright was Secretary of State, the US announced its return to Asia. But now, the United States is stuck in a quagmire in Ukraine and is also facing difficulties in the Middle East. This makes it difficult for the United States to fully pivot to Asia, which is not in America's national interest. What's even worse is that the US has pushed Russia into China's arms. Mearsheimer says we need to think carefully. We now live in a world with three major powers: the United States, China, and Russia. If the US sees China as its main competitor and intends to contain China in East Asia, then having Russia on its side is a very wise choice. But now, what the United States is doing in the Ukraine war is actually bringing Russia and China even closer together. Mearsheimer recalls that at the end of the Cold War in 1990, China and the United States were basically allies, working together against the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US no longer needed China's help to contain the Soviets. The question is, how should the United States have treated China at that time? In the early 1990s, when China's economy was still underdeveloped, the United States adopted a policy of engagement with China, aiming to turn it into a very wealthy country. This is a country with a population 4 times that of the United States, and yet you want to make it extremely rich. For a realist like Mearsheimer, this approach was simply a crazy idea. He said that the United States was essentially nurturing a peer competitor, and possibly creating a country even more powerful than itself. But at the time, the entire US foreign policy establishment almost unanimously supported this policy. This included hawkish figures, such as former national security advisors Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger. They all said that China could achieve economic growth, the US could bring it into international organizations like the World Trade Organization, China would become a democracy, and then we would all live happily ever after. As a result, the US propelled China's astonishing growth, and from 1990 to 2017, China became a major power. By 2017, there were already 3 major powers on the planet, and one of the superpowers was China, standing as a peer competitor to the United States. It was because of America's misguided beliefs that it helped and created this competitor. This was an extremely disastrous decision. Host Carlson asked, even the most famous people in your field of international relations strangely did this foolish thing. Why did this happen? Mearsheimer recalled that in the early 2000s, he debated with Brzezinski in Washington about whether China could rise peacefully. At the time, Foreign Policy magazine also gave a detailed report on their conversation. Brzezinski argued that China could rise peacefully, while Mearsheimer believed that China could not coexist peacefully with the United States and that a peaceful rise was impossible. He thought America's engagement policy was foolish. He said that when Brzezinski was speaking, he was sitting on stage thinking to himself, I really don't understand what this is all about. Brzezinski was almost 10 times more conservative than him on nearly every foreign policy issue. He really shouldn't have been the one putting forward these views. But at that time, no one in the United States wanted to listen to what he had to say. He said that now everyone should realize that he was basically right, and his opponents back then were wrong. He believes you have to remember that the 2 main components of military power are wealth and population size. With wealth and population size, you can build a powerful military, which affects your position in the global balance of power. He said that, as a realist, his view is that in the international system and international politics, because there is no higher authority to protect you when a country gets into trouble, having strong power becomes extremely important. You can't just dial 911 in the international system and expect someone to come save you. In this world, another country might be powerful and could attack you. So, becoming the most powerful country in the system becomes extremely important. And the last thing you want is to become weak. Remember, the Chinese refer to the period from the late 1840s to the late 1940s as the century of humiliation. Yes, that's exactly right. How did China end up suffering a century of national humiliation? Because they were weak, because they were divided. He said, remember he just talked about NATO's expansion. and here we're discussing why NATO keeps expanding, pushing forward, and pushing even further. Even though the Russians say that NATO's eastward expansion right up to their borders is unacceptable, the United States still tells them it will push ahead regardless. The reason the United States insists on pushing forward is because we believe Russia is weak, so you absolutely don't want to be weak, you want to be strong. But the issue being discussed now is that the United States was once very powerful, but used that power in foolish ways. This makes Mearsheimer very unhappy. He hopes America can use its power wisely. However, considering America's performance in recent decades, he doesn't have high expectations for American decision-making. After listening to Mearsheimer's analysis, a few points can be summarized. First, he believes that America's ruling elites made a huge mistake in the past. They shouldn't have allowed China, a country with such a large population, to become wealthy and powerful, to the point where it can now challenge the United States. Second, the international community is becoming increasingly assertive, and NATO keeps expanding eastward, pushing forward again and again, because the US thinks Russia is weak. But the US made a mistake. It shouldn't have been so hard to wage a proxy war, yet in the end, it lost. Third, he thinks the US should have teamed up with Russia to counter China, but instead, it foolishly pushed Russia toward China, causing the two countries to join forces against the US, rather than isolating China to deal with it alone. Fourth, Mearsheimer approaches things from the perspective of American interests. Of course, we may not like everything he says, but his analysis of America's strategic mistakes does seem to hit the mark.